Hi there, good afternoon. My name is Jennifer Turner, and I direct the China Environment Forum here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. I usually do morning meetings, so this 4 o'clock thing is a little odd to me, but I like to start on time because I like to reward all of you who were indeed timely coming to our afternoon meeting. Yes, summer may be over, but the fun's not. Came to the Woodrow Wilson Center to join, like you're joining family today from where I'm standing. Here at just to give a little bit of background in case you don't know, the Woodrow Wilson Center, we've been around since 1968. We were created by Congress as a memorial to Woodrow Wilson. And we've got now 20-some projects and programs that focus on various foreign policy meetings. And today's meeting is co-sponsored by a troika of the China Environment Forum, Asia Program, and the Kissinger Institute. And you know, so it's a meeting, but as I was starting to say, it's a family thing. Because I got Tim Hildebrand here. Now it's Dr. Tim Hildebrand. He's a lecturer at the Social Policy and Development in the Department of Social Policy at the London School of Economics and Political Science. But really, he was my assistant and the editor of my publication back in 2001, too long ago. Hung out, but I had to share him. It was for the Asia program. Bob Hathaway, he's out there hiding somewhere. Bob, where are you? There's Bob right in front of me. We shared Tim, and I swear he was supposed to be 50-50, but I swear he was 100-100 for both of us. And in the course of our work, when in the China Environment Forum, at that point, we were doing a lot of meetings and exchanges with Chinese environmental NGOs. And they really kind of sparked Tim's interest. So much so, he went and did a PhD up in Wisconsin, looking at Chinese NGOs, but he didn't just stay looking at the green movement. He really, I mean, for those of you that look at China and probably know the field, very cutting edge kind of dissertation. Are you getting embarrassed yet, Tim? You okay?
No, not yet.
Not yet?
I'm waiting now.
I mean, because he looked at not only environmental NGOs, but HIV/AIDS NGOs and gay, lesbian, bisexual groups, and looked at their relationship to the state. And not only snagged him the dissertation, but he wrote a book. And he's here today to talk about his book. The meeting topic today is called Growing Up and Going Out, the Development and Internationalization of Chinese NGOs. And I'm really excited because I've been reading his research over the years, and I find that I still focus more on the green groups, but Tim, your work has helped me think a lot differently about the green groups, just that that it's so easy to romanticize, right? But we're not just going to romanticize NGOs here today. We're going to get down and dirty and kind of look at the trends. Now, family means that there's another family member up here today is Guobing Yang, and he was a fellow here at the Wilson Center back in 2003, 2004. And I was lucky when I first met you that you approached us because you wanted to look into Chinese environmental NGOs. Right. And I gave you a few introductions, and you just took off like gangbusters and ended up writing what was the first book really on Chinese civil society and the internet. And that's why we lured him here to the Wilson Center. And you still do great work on civil society. So what's going to happen here today, and I'm going to stop talking shortly because you came to hear Tim and Guoming Yang. Tim is going to give a talk. I've told him 25 minutes. We'll see what that happens. And then Guobing Yang is going to make some comments because it's a rare opportunity to really start to dig more deeply into the subtlety of the Chinese NGO movement. So, not too embarrassed, okay?
No, not yet.
All right, so
I'm still waiting.
You're still waiting. Well, wait till the Q&A.
Right.
Yeah, can we welcome Tim Hildebrand?
Thank you, Jennifer. Now I'm trying to say this without getting too emotional. But I mean, the reality is about 10 years ago, I think both independently, Jennifer and Bob said something like, if I write a book, I'll do a book event for you. And so I can think of this as kind of getting back at you for putting me through so much work while I was here at the Wilson Center. But no, in all seriousness, and this isn't hyperbole, this book wouldn't exist without the Wilson Center. This book wouldn't exist without the amazing mentoring of both Jennifer and Bob. So I thank both of you and all of my colleagues at the Wilson Center, some of whom are still here, and others have gone to do other different great things. So the talk today, as Jennifer suggested, is really to kind of give you a nice overview of the book and then also kind of tie that to the work that I'm sort of embarking on now, which is really getting at this question of the internationalization of Chinese NGOs, which in and of itself sort of suggests that that I started looking at NGOs at a time when they were growing up, and now they're starting to go out, and it's another moment where I realize how old I actually am. 10 years since I've been here. It's amazing. So the puzzle that motivated the research is sort of a basic one. It's actually not a puzzle to a lot of folks who study China or China watchers, but it is a puzzle for those who look at NGOs sort of writ large in the world, which is that Chinese NGOs have emerged, but authoritarianism itself has persisted. So ultimately, I was interested in answering these questions. How do NGOs emerge in closed political systems like China? What specific steps do they take to survive? What adaptations do they make? What effect has the emergence of Chinese NGOs had on the political status quo? This is that kind of authoritarianism versus democracy question. And how will the nature of NGO development affect the future of activism in China and NGO-state relations elsewhere, which gets to this issue of internationalization. It's always important, I think, to tell you a little bit about what makes my book unique and why you might want to spend $90 to purchase it.
Well, he says you're working on getting it out in paperback.
Yes.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, 20% off with the flyer out in the front. One of the things that make this book unique is that it focuses on process. That is to say, how these NGOs actually emerge in China, and not on what seems to be a presumed result. It's not ultimately interested in, do NGOs lead to democracy, right? It's interested solely in the question of, how do they emerge in China? We can ask very interesting questions and have interesting discussions about what happens next, but that's not what ultimately the book is about. It's a larger N, so looking at many different NGOs in different issue areas. As Jennifer already suggested, environmental NGOs are very well studied by very good people. But one of the things that I realized very early on is that there wasn't enough work on environmental NGOs in a grander context. So I ended up choosing these other cases, which I'll talk about later. The third bit is that it disaggregates the state. It looks not just at the central government, China as Beijing, but China as many different, very complicated parts. Moreover, it's not just attentive to state, it's actually more attentive to society. The book is far more interested in the steps that social actors make to survive within the context, rather than what the state does to social actors, which is quite different. And then finally, as actually previewed by Jennifer, the book de-romanticizes activism. One of the real deficiencies I saw in a lot of the work on NGOs in China and generally is that we make a lot of assumptions about what NGOs are like and what the leaders want. We tend to think that NGO leaders are idealists who don't really care about money, don't care so much about politics. They're just passionate. The reality is that it's far more complicated than that. It's not just a cause for them, but it's also a career. Maybe even more importantly, it's a career. I really examine these leaders as economic actors. So a little bit about these three cases. We know a lot about environmental NGOs because that's what most of the work has been done on. But I wanted to choose other cases to examine that might put it into a better context. And I chose them on sort of these two different variables, the key independent variable on the left-hand side and the dependent variable, which is state response. Some people might call this repression. I wanted to think about it more broadly. Does the state respond positively or negatively to NGOs? On the y-axis, this is the goals and policy correlation. I suspected that as organizations' goals and state policies matched each other, the more correlated they were, they'd probably have a better relationship. There'd be a more positive state response. And I chose three different sectors that actually all probably had generally positive responses from the state, but there would be variation across them. The idea was that environmental NGOs, because they've been so successful, because they've tended to enjoy good relationships with the government, would have sort of the most positive state response. HIV/AIDS organizations in some areas had a more positive sort of relationship with the government, I suspected. And then gay and lesbian organizations, I figured probably wouldn't, primarily because what state policies would gay and lesbian organizations actually have sort of in common? How did I do the research? Very quickly. Field research in China from 07 to 08 goes to show you how long it takes to get a book out in academia. That's how old the data is. I can talk a little bit about what might have changed in the Q&A as well. This was based on in-depth semi-structured interviews and a survey that was conducted on the web, both analyzed qualitative and quantitatively. Take a quick look at the map, because this shows you where my key and secondary research sites were, the key sites being Beijing and Yunnan, and then Sichuan and Hunan. I chose these cases for assumed variation in sort of all of these questions that I was interested in. What do the NGOs have to work with in China? This was my analytical framework in the book. Actually, it's how the book is organized. The book is organized in 3 parts, along the lines of what we could think of as political opportunities. These are sort of policy windows that exist that allow organizations to flourish. Economic opportunities, which is actually probably the biggest part of the book, as you might notice. These are the financial resources that are oftentimes related to political opportunities. And then finally, the personal opportunities. This is about personal relationships that individuals within organizations have with individuals within the government. We might say this is about guanxi. I kind of make it a little bit bigger, more general than just an issue of guanxi. And all of these opportunities emerge in sort of several different ways. To some extent, these opportunities for NGOs have emerged because of economic development and the unintended side effects of economic development, whether that be environmental degradation, which has been a topic of obviously real focus at the Wilson Center, HIV/AIDS that has come about through, frankly speaking, the movement of peoples, right, across borders more easily. But also this has come through indirectly state policies, namely state policies on decentralization and simply downsizing the state apparatus. This small state, big society concept. The state is no longer going to be doing the things that they used to do. So someone has to fill the gap. This is an opportunity for NGOs to emerge. And sort of this is sort of the most by design, where you have the state actually managing organizations through legal registration. I'm not going to dwell on this now. I wrote a piece in the China Quarterly that you can read if you're interested in, or I can talk about it in the Q&A. So again, this was sort of the expectation that I had in choosing these cases. Now, if this is what actually happened sort of in reality, the book wouldn't be terribly interesting, right? In order for a book to be interesting, you want it to be surprising. And it was surprising to me. NGO-state relations were ultimately sort of as I expected in Beijing, okay, where environmental NGOs probably had the most positive relationship with the state, gay and lesbian organizations having the least positive. But I placed them closer because actually there wasn't as much variation as I expected across the 3 cases. The differences come when we look at areas outside of Beijing. And what's quite clear is that local interests in China matter much more than central interests do. Decentralization is playing a big role. When the state essentially says you're on your own in a lot of sectors, obviously you're going to get more variation at local levels, whether it's in terms of local priorities or implementation of policies that come from the center. There's also this notion that the incentive structures for promotion among government officials will really complicate the political space. It's not surprising, I think, for most of us that Chinese government officials care about one thing when it comes to promotion, and that's economic development. And so this degree to which they stress economic development is going to increase or decrease these opportunities. So when you look at the other areas where the research was conducted, you're going to see sort of all of these 3 cases sequenced differently, right? In a place like Hunan, for instance, the provincial government is really kind of concerned about its reputation in regards to HIV/AIDS, primarily because the HIV/AIDS crisis in Hunan was caused by the provincial government, okay? local government officials who were involved in plasma selling. So you can see that HIV/AIDS there is really kind of on the negative state response side, because local interests differ in Hunan. Okay, looking at a place like Yunnan used to be sort of what do they call the SEZ of NGOs, special economic zone of NGOs. It was this environment that was supposed to flourish, or sort of environment in which NGOs should flourish, and environmental NGOs in particular. And that was the case until Western Development Plan came through, and there was an opportunity for actually, real money to be made by within the province and promotion among the cadres, at which point environmental NGOs sort of lost a lot of that political space, and so they sort of slid down. HIV/AIDS, on the other hand, these NGOs actually have flourished in Yunnan primarily because the provincial government is expressly interested in controlling the spread of HIV/AIDS in the province. Moreover, supporting the work of NGOs or allowing NGOs to do this work doesn't actually work against their economic interests, and that's the key point. Environmental work among NGOs in Yunnan works against economic interest, and that is against the interest of the state. Okay? Likewise, gay and lesbian organizations, I found, actually had a very positive relationship with the state, primarily because they were doing work on HIV/AIDS, and there you have overlap across the two sectors. What's clear from looking at sort of a subnational view of NGO-state relations is that all politics are local in China, right? Which is not too different from the United States, right? NGO choices are highly constrained by local government interests. Moreover, close relationships with the central government don't necessarily guarantee viability. If all politics are local, these NGOs are actually far more concerned about the relationship with those local government officials than they are the central government officials. They see the central government officials on a regular basis. That's the relationship that they're most concerned about maintaining. As I suggested with the Yunnan case, these regions that were once sort of a heaven for NGOs have become kind of a hell for NGOs. And again, this can change very, very quickly. In fact, I think when I began doing the work, Yunnan was that heaven.
Yunnan was called the Green Province,
Yeah.
and actually a lot of, if I can interject, is that a lot of international environmental groups are no longer based in
Sure.
Yunnan.
Yep. So the environment can change very quickly when local government interests can change. But what's important and sort of a real key part of the book here, again, it's not just the state that is in control of civil society. And it's not just the state that is going to dictate whether a NGO succeeds or doesn't succeed in China. There's a lot of room for sort of NGO agency. Because as government interests change, NGOs must adapt to stay within their good graces, to maintain the opportunities that they once have. So that's what they actually do. The book ends up having a lot of kind of sort of a list of different strategies, an exploration of the strategies that NGOs employ in China. And I'm going to highlight just a few of them here. And of course, if you want to read the rest, it's in my book, which you can purchase 20% off at 72 US dollars. No, 20%. So the first most obvious adaptation is that organizations quite explicitly will change the activities that they're engaged in to match the interest of the local government. And this can happen one of two ways. It can actually happen where they literally change the activities that they do. But sometimes it's about just using the right rhetoric. So it was fascinating to me that when I was doing my research in the field back in 2007, 2008, this is when sort of harmonious society was used by the Chinese government. And without fail, all of the NGOs that had written material mentioned that, guess what? The work that they did helped ensure a harmonious society in China. I don't think that they were changing what they were doing, but they changed how they sold what they were doing to the government. They changed the rhetoric. Another sort of adaptation that they employ is that they increase the transparency of their work. They do this because they want to convince the state that they're not up to no good, that they don't have sort of a nefarious plan to overthrow the state. They do this in one of two ways. They can do it actually very actively, where they publish all of their meeting minutes on their websites. But also they do it passively, which is maybe the most interesting, where you had organizations that were telling me, well, we don't put passwords on our computers. The reason they don't put passwords on the computers is because they know they're going to be visited by, say, the local PSB. And if they put passwords on the computers, that's telling them sort of, well, we have something to hide. So you don't put on passwords because you don't have anything to hide. Another particularly interesting strategy here is that organizations recognize that the government, as it gives more responsibility to social actors, is a little bit concerned about its own reputation. It doesn't want people to think, government can't do anything, NGOs are the ones who are doing the real work. So what they do is when they are successful, they're very careful to give credit to the government for their own success. So even if they came up with a strategy, say on methadone treatments that were illegal in China, they would turn around and give credit to the government, even though the government did nothing, right? But they recognize that the government they're a little bit sensitive, maybe, about how they're perceived, and they want to make sure that they don't get a little upset about the work that they're doing. They're also mindful that the government is most concerned not about the articulation of interests. The state is most concerned about the aggregation of interest. The state is most concerned about NGOs that are networking with each other. That's the potential threat, not NGOs working independently necessarily. So groups actually avoid networking with other organizations. Moreover, when an individual activist gets in trouble, you see sort of this massive movement away from that activist. Sort of saying, well, he was up to no good anyway. He didn't know the way that you're supposed to actually work with the state. Now you can see how this could be bad for building civil society, that no one wants to really talk to each other. No one really wants to network with each other. Incredibly problematic. So what are the implications of the work? It's quite clear, in my estimation, that the relationship between NGOs and the authoritarian government's not zero-sum. It's not as if the authoritarian government sort of improves or kind of increases its stability, and the NGOs sort of fall by the wayside. They actually both can benefit from this relationship, which is why I characterize it in the book as a codependent relationship. And this is not limited to China. This is actually something that I think can travel well outside of the Chinese context, where you have NGOs that exist because the state allows them to exist. The NGO thus needs the state to acquiesce and say, yes, not only can you do this work, but we need you to do this work. Likewise, the state needs social actors to do that work, which makes it codependent. And sort of not to drag it too much into psychology, because I'm not a psychologist, but like any codependent relationship, of course there are power asymmetries. So the state, yes, has more power than society. But that doesn't mean that the state doesn't need society, nor does it mean that the society doesn't need the state. One of the big implications of the findings from the book is that NGOs can actually strengthen authoritarianism. Now, this should be most surprising to us, because we think that NGOs are going to ultimately undermine an authoritarian regime. But the argument that I make in the book is if that society needs these social actors to do the things that it can't do, the important work like working on environmental degradation, stopping the spread of HIV/AIDS, if that was undone, right, or rather not done, by any actor, this could undermine the legitimacy of the state. But by contracting out to social actors, they can actually solve these problems and sort of maintain the legitimacy over the long term. That's surprising. And also by de-romanticizing NGOs, the leaders and their strategic and economic behavior is revealed. And that becomes very important to understand why NGOs sort of make the choices moving forward in terms of who their funders will be, how they'll actually make money in, sorry, not make money, well, I'm sort of already going to my next slide, how they actually get enough resources to operate over the long term. So understanding this development within China can really help us understand other emerging patterns, both in China and elsewhere. One of the things that I don't want to sort of ignore is the fact that working within the confines of the system, NGOs can actually make change at the margins. It's not simply just responding to state needs, okay? But it's not the massive change that we're necessarily expecting. One of the other sort of policy implications, which I would assume is sort of interest to some people in the audience, is if in fact these NGOs, in doing work well, the work that they think is important, say in dealing with environmental degradation or stopping the spread of HIV/AIDS, if they do it well, they might have to do it with the help of the state. In fact, they have to do it with the help of the state. And in doing that work well, they might actually strengthen the state, which seems to be counter to the expectations that many funders have, which is by supporting NGOs, you can do two things. You support the building of civil society and solving these social problems. Maybe not. Maybe we can't get everything that we want. I'm going to resist the temptation to start singing the Rolling Stones song. It also explains, I think, the appeal of alternative models of funding for NGOs. Something that I haven't talked about in this talk, which I talk about in other talks quite a bit, is that what's most vexing for these NGOs is not their relations with the Chinese government. It's getting enough money to sustain themselves over the long term. And one of my other sort of future projects here looks at alternative models that NGOs are beginning to use. And one of these is to sort of mold themselves or evolve into sort of social enterprises that use for-profit models of sustaining themselves rather than sort of sticking with the traditional nonprofit NGO model. A lot of implications sort of flow from there, which I'm more than happy to talk about in the Q&A as well. But the part that I want to talk about for the last few minutes of my talk is that success in China, so the emergence of NGOs in China and the creation of this sort of maybe unique, maybe not, model of state-society relations might be exportable. And here's how. The Chinese government has embarked upon this go-out policy, right? And we've heard about this primarily in Africa, where the Chinese government has increased investment, FDI, and government activity generally in sub-Saharan Africa. But what's been ignored by most of the literature on this move to Africa in particular, but the rest of the world in general, is that there's a society angle to this. Now, many of us in the room probably know that this happens in the West as well, when we have American NGOs that go to other parts of the world to work with, either local individuals or other organizations themselves. And this is actually beginning to happen among Chinese NGOs, where Chinese NGOs are sort of following the lead of the state in going out and beginning activities in places like sub-Saharan Africa. One of the activities that these organizations have done has been engaging in capacity building of civil society in Africa. This has a lot of implications. The key questions that I'm interested in here is what happens then when NGOs who are doing the teaching, so if Chinese NGOs are now teaching African NGOs, when they emerge within this context, this maybe unique context of NGO-state relations within an authoritarian regime, is that what they teach, right? You know your own environment best. Do you teach what you were taught, right? And what might that mean for the development of NGOs in Africa? What effect could this have on, generally, NGO-state relations elsewhere? So there are several hypotheses that I have. The first is nothing, right? The null hypothesis, that maybe these Chinese NGOs that have gone to places like Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa and worked with local NGOs, maybe they're not going to have any effect, okay? That's not really an interesting hypothesis. The first real hypothesis here would be that they would have an effect, but that effect would really be an unintended or weak effect, right? That they might sort of not explicitly say, this is the way that you deal with the state, but they tell them how they emerged within this context and sort of rubs off. The result might be that these organizations might sort of skew more, maybe not pro-authoritarian is the right term, but look more like Chinese NGOs in their relationship with their own government. The second would be, well, maybe these organizations have actually been sent there by the Chinese government, which some of these have. If they've been sent there by the Chinese government, they might actually have a very intended and strong effect on these sort of nascent local NGOs. It might sort of skew towards this authoritarian model. The third is that they might have an effect, but it's not as the state could intend, right? Maybe once, as the Chinese idiom goes, once the emperor is far and the mountains are high and Chinese NGOs are really far away from Beijing, maybe they'll start sort of going into the mode that they've sort of the mode of state-society relations that they've read about among NGOs in the West and begin to sort of teach another way of interacting with the state. This could be sort of closer to what we know of as transnational activism. Alternatively, another hypothesis is maybe the Chinese NGOs themselves could be reshaped. Maybe once they leave maybe if they leave the national borders of China, they get re-socialized by, say, Western NGOs that are operating in Southeast Asia and in Africa. Could happen, right? The fifth hypothesis, maybe Chinese NGOs and Western NGOs actually come into conflict and sort of engage in a soft power war, right, in places like sub-Saharan Africa. I don't know, but this could happen. And the sixth hypothesis is that the effect of Chinese NGOs and Western NGOs maybe is not too different. And maybe that's because this notion of codependent state-society relations is not just Chinese. And maybe there is something, not that I'm comparing the political systems at all between, say, the authoritarian government in China and a democratic government in the West, for instance, but maybe the way that NGOs have evolved around the world looks far more similar across these contexts than we might have assumed. How do we actually test these? Well, that's what I'm going to be doing. That's the next project. The project is funded by the British Academy, and I'm going to be researching these Chinese NGOs that are operating in 3 sub-Saharan African countries, and also working on Chinese NGOs. But one of the big things that I'm going to be interested in, this is not a surprise because this is one of the main findings of the book, is that where these NGOs get their money actually matters quite a bit. Are they getting their money from the outside? Are they getting their money from the state, through the state? That might actually change the effect that they might have in this internationalization. So that's essentially where we're kind of bringing what we've learned from the emergence of NGOs and how the way that NGOs emerge in China might actually end up shaping the way that they interact with the rest of the world once they go outside of the rest of the world, which shows us how far Chinese NGOs have come, right? When we started working on Chinese NGOs, we didn't imagine a situation anytime soon where they'd be working not, outside of the borders. Maybe Southeast Asia, but Africa, no. I mean, this is quite a leap, so it suggests that they have come quite far. So I'm going to leave it there, and hopefully we can talk about some of these issues in the Q&A after Guobin gives his thoughts.
And I have questions too.
Great, thank you.
More opportunities to embarrass you.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. You're going to come stand with your little iPad.
I think. Good afternoon. It's really a great pleasure and honor to return to the Wilson Center for Tim Hildebrandt's new book. I'd like to thank Bob Hathaway and Jennifer Turner and Tim for inviting me to this event, but I also like to take this opportunity to thank Bob and Jennifer and many others at the Wilson Center for hosting me for a year, a whole decade ago, when I was just beginning my own research on NGOs and internet activism. So it's a great pleasure to be back. Tim's book, Social Organizations and the Authoritarian State in China, I think, is the most important monograph to have appeared on Chinese NGOs and civil society in recent years. To my knowledge, no one has systematically compared NGOs in 3 major issue areas in China. Environmental NGOs are well studied by others, but still Tim's work has a new angle. But then HIV/AIDS and gays and lesbian NGOs together, a comparative angle is really important and refreshing. And as Tim just explained to us, I think his analysis is dispassionate, is disinterested, and highly critical, revealing high competition over resources and a donor-driven orientation among NGOs in China, a dimension that has not really attracted a lot of attention in the field, but really is important. It is refreshing perspective, especially as again Tim mentioned, and my own reading of the book is that current literature often assumes, without critical examination, that NGOs exist only for the good of society. The book challenges two dominant arguments in the field. One is that it challenges the civil society argument for its overemphasis on the independence of social organizations in China. It also challenges a very influential corporatist argument for its neglect of the agency of civic groups. And I like very much Tim's perspective of codependency between state and NGOs. His own argument is that Chinese NGOs are strategically self-limiting organizations which seek to survive and grow in an authoritarian state by adapting to the available opportunities. And there are different types of opportunities that he analyzes. The book shows that for the most part, these NGOs have done a pretty good job in achieving this goal of adapting to the circumstances and achieving growth over time. I think this is a very balanced and convincing argument, and the book is full of very rich details that are there to support this argument. And I think the fascinating part of the book really lies in all those little details. For instance, I remember a few like why we know that a lot of the NGOs in China are not registered. Unregistered NGOs exist. It's quite common. It's not like they can't, but many of them don't want to register. Well, that's something also counterintuitive. These kind of details are many, and I'm not going to mention all of them so that you can all read them from the book. But at the same time that Tim makes the argument, he also argues, at least I think it implies, that because of their self-limiting character and their willingness to work with the government, Chinese NGOs have relatively limited political impact, relatively limited influence in producing political change. I think by political change, Tim means mainly regime change, democratization, or the change from the current authoritarian regime to a democratic regime. Question that this raises is that whether this might not put too onerous a burden on citizen civil groups in China, whose immediate concern is not necessarily regime change, but social justice, equal opportunity, jobs for college students, education for children, for example, a comfortable life, and maybe even a fast internet. These kind of things are the more immediate concerns of the regular citizens and civic groups. Perhaps a longer historical perspective may help to contextualize this argument and give us some more confidence, I hope, about the role of NGOs and civil society as agents of change. The first wave of studies of NGOs and civil society was triggered by the Velvet Revolution in former Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union and the Chinese student protest in 1989. Sociologists have argued that the development of incipient civil society in the 1980s in China, for example, such as study groups on campus, editorial boards, cultural activism of all kinds, even academic conferences and workshops of this kind, paved the way for the large-scale protest movements in 1989. by building formal and informal social networks for mobilization and for the exchange of new ideas. One lesson about civil society activities from that time, therefore, is that these groups and activities were not intent on a regime change or any form of radical political change. Some were interested in reform from within the system. There was a very influential System Reform Institute, for example, at the time. But many were simply excited about new ideas and the possibilities of organizing among themselves for the exchanging and discussion of new ideas. But after the protest started in April 1989, these informal networks easily turned into social basis for mobilization. And what this means, I think, is that a pre-existing social organizational infrastructure is necessary, though not sufficient, for mobilization to happen. That's why I think the argument that contemporary Chinese NGOs do not push for political change should not be taken to mean that they do not matter. Again, if we look at the history of the NGOs, that might help a little bit. If we take 1994, the year when the Friends of Nature was founded, often taken to be the first major NGO in China, as the symbolic starting point of the development of new types of NGOs in China. Now we have 20 years already, and I would like to note two developments in these two decades in the field of NGOs. First is that there are now, compared with mid-1990s, a great many more NGOs working on a great variety of issues, to the extent that I think we may be able to say that NGOs have become an accepted part of Chinese political culture and even achieved a minimal degree of institutionalization. Some NGOs offer a career path. There are even career incentives. Others offer volunteering opportunities, and they attract many young students. The role of NGOs is more recognized than before as a force of promoting social justice, as well as social service. For example, after the Sichuan earthquakes in 2008, grassroots NGOs and private foundations were very efficient in mobilizing resources. Labor NGOs in the Pearl River Delta region, in Shenzhen, in Guangzhou, have been very actively providing legal aid service to migrant workers. As grassroots NGOs gain more influence, we also see an interesting phenomenon, which is that official government-sponsored NGOs seem to be experiencing some kind of credibility crisis. A very notable example in recent years is the sort of online scandalizing of the Chinese Red Cross. It's a whole complicated story, which I don't think I have time to go into. But that's one, I think, important trend that we see over the past 2 decades. The second one is that, and this is certainly open to question, but my sense is that although most NGOs mostly rely on non-confrontational, non-adversarial methods, there seems to be a trend in recent years towards more assertive form of action. For example, we take the field of environmental activism. In the mid-1990s, early 2000s, and late 90s, most the major campaigns were about animal protection.
Battery recycling, endangered species. So environmental activists in urban centers in Beijing, they were moving outward, away from home, to deal with issues at a distance, because those were politically safe issues. In recent years, many of these NGOs are moving back home. They are shifting their attention back home to issues like solid waste, incinerators, urban incinerators, and so on, and beginning to take on more contentious issues. One example is the Nature University in Beijing. I think one of their used to be Green Beagle.
Green Beagle, that's right. They've recently had a campaign about information disclosure of solid waste incinerator in Guangzhou, and a combined use of legal action with publicity campaign on Chinese Weibo, and quite aggressively pushed for information disclosure, and I think they succeeded. So those are two broad trends that are notable for understanding what kind of achievement that we can talk about when we talk about Chinese NGOs. Let me conclude by talking a little bit about the future of civil society NGOs. I think Tim's book really contains insightful lessons for understanding the future of NGOs and civil society. As he argues, his analysis about various forms of political opportunities, economic opportunities, and so on, really it's quite essential for us to note, and in order to understand how Chinese NGOs are going to survive in the future, how they have to deal with those kinds of opportunities. But I would like to add that there are at least two other broad trends which also merit attention. One is the changing mode of governance. In the past decade, as we know, and as many experts on Chinese politics have frequently observed, Chinese political regime has demonstrated strong capacity and skills to adapt to the changing circumstances, including managing the recent wave of social protest. In a recent article, Professor Elizabeth Perry at Harvard University argues that one often neglected but important factor in the staying power of the Chinese state is that it has the facility to make a case for its right to rule in terms that resonates with its own people. Professor Perry sees this as a form of cultural governance, which she defines as the deployment of symbolic resources as an instrument of political authority. I think this form of cultural governance is in full swing in recent years, with leaders like Wen Jiabao and now Xi Jinping trying to really strike a popular posture as benevolent, paternal figures of the nation, and with government agencies, including the official media, showing more responsiveness to citizens' voices and demands. In the long run, if this form of cultural governance proves to be effective, the question becomes not whether NGOs and citizens will be able to challenge the political regime, but whether they will want to do so at all. Because it is possible that the new leadership and regime will rebuild a form of moral authority, combining nationalism with traditional culture, with popularism, to which civil society and citizens might respond in a more positive way. So that's one trend about governance. The other trend is what I call the digitization of civil society. We know that the internet has been an integral part of the growth of civil society. It appeared about the same time as the first contingent of NGOs in the mid-1990s. And many registered and many unregistered citizen groups really rely heavily on the internet. Some influential groups in the fields of health, environmental protection, LGBT, first started their online communities and then gradually evolved into offline NGOs. So to some extent, I think we can talk about a digital civil society in China consisting of a great variety of online groups. Earlier BBS forums, nowadays more recently Weibo circles, WeChat circles, all kinds of circles, small informal type of NGOs. There is, of course, a great deal of censorship and surveillance of the internet in China, but it's hard not to see how being online gives Chinese citizens and civil society groups more room for organizing and voicing protest. So I think in addition to the opportunity structures, the various opportunity structures that NGOs have to deal with, we also see that at least these two other important trends in the shaping of the future of Chinese civil society. One is the party state, trying to win over civil society through hegemonic means. The other is the new spaces for political participation on the internet. I think And I agree with Tim that NGOs will continue to be strategically self-limiting actors, but they will act. They're just not self-limiting actors, but they will act. And as to how they're going to act, I think, again, we will learn a lot from Tim's book. So please buy a copy of Tim's book. Thank you.
Thank you. We're not so subtle up here, are we? Yeah, so I want to ask, can I ask one question first? Okay, yeah, like you could stop me. No, I really loved your presentation and loved the comments. And so, Tim, I'm going to ask you a question. Because you did make the comment, but you keep your hands on the pulse of Chinese NGOs. I mean, but your book was focused on your study. But, I mean, one big trend that you hinted to, Guobin, was that, these protests, right? I mean, one thing that's really different from when Tim and I started, when we really started, he was my first assistant, right? So when we really started looking into NGOs in China is that, you go to China and you talk, you got to talk to your taxi driver to know what's going on in China, right? And you talk to your taxi driver and you kind of mention, well, I'm here, I'm working with some Chinese NGOs. They're like, you say it all in Chinese. Like, huh? NGOs? We have NGOs? We have Rome. And, there's kind of a lack of awareness of the public. But what I thought was really struck with the airpocalypse earlier this year is that it wasn't just, a lot of Chinese NGOs, they were kind of like the surfers on the big wave. Because you had a lot of public discontent because they were choking on the air. And then you saw a lot of groups who'd been, they had these kind of institutions in waiting, ready to go, like, these information disclosure requests, the stuff on the internet, the Weibo went crazy. A lot of, I think even Green Beagle and others were renting air quality monitoring equipment, more shaming and naming, Ma Jun. Others have taken advantage. Do you think that, I'm not saying that, you still have to buy his book, but, but things are changing in China. And do you think that this, I mean, you talked mainly about civil society and the state, but I'm seeing we got the Chinese public in there now, too.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think definitely compared to when we started looking at these issues, they're more mature, right? And I think there is more institutionalization, but these groups are still pretty small, right, and not institutionalized. Again, they suffer more than anything else from a lack of financial resources. So, some of them have been able to sort of, thrive in the short term, but the concerns that they have about long-term sustainability are very, very real. But the point that you make about the general public is a very good one, and Guobin sort of touched on this as well in terms of sort of people's knowledge that these organizations exist and to what extent they sort of rely upon them. You had mentioned the point about sort of the gongos kind of coming into all of these troubles with the Red Cross scandal and whatnot. And gongos are these government-organized, non-governmental organizations. And which is still funny to say that, right? But it's so normal now. But what's interesting about gongos is that even scholars sometimes have trouble recognizing what a gongo is and what an NGO is. And if scholars who study these things don't really know what a government can't really differentiate a gongo from an NGO, needless to say, the general public is having trouble as well. And some research that hasn't even been published, but not done by myself, has done public polling of citizens about their impression of NGOs. And unfortunately, it's not very positive. It's actually a pretty negative impression that people have of NGOs in China, and it's getting worse over time. And maybe that has to do with the fact that there are these gongos that had scandals. And if people can't differentiate between a gongo and an NGO, any problem that a gongo has, an NGO essentially has to sort of pay for. So while people have come to rely upon them, and I think there's a wide recognition that NGOs filled an important gap in the Sichuan earthquake, I don't know how long that good reputation can last. Because a scandal like that can ruin that reputation very quickly, even if the people involved in earthquake response had nothing to do with any sort of instance of corruption.
But then you also said that the NGOs, to kind of protect themselves, will often, attribute their success to the government support or, and not want to highlight the fact that most of the Chinese environmental NGOs, and I assume it's also the same for the HIV/AIDS ones, they get their money from international organizations.
Well, they get their money from international organizations, but the complication with HIV/AIDS organizations is that international funding is often filtered through the central government. So the central government actually has a role in deciding who gets the money. So it's not completely sort of outside the purview of the state, and that complicates things quite a great deal.
And that's really different from the green groups. All right, they're waiting oh so patiently. We have two. Oh, Bob gets to go first because he's we share Tim, then we share him now. Here we go, Bob Hathaway from the Asia Program with a question.
It's a good thing you called on me, Jennifer. Is this on?
Let's switch on the bottom. We gave him a dead mic.
Now?
Yes.
There we go.
So it's a good thing you called on me, Jennifer. I want to echo Jennifer's sense of a feeling of pride in welcoming back two of our own. Guobin, you were already something of a recognized scholar with a growing reputation before you got here. I'm aware of at least 2 books that you've published since you were here, both of which the Wilson Center had some connection in. And so we take great pride in your continuing accomplishments. Tim, you didn't yet have too much of an international reputation when you were here, but obviously things are very different. And so I welcome Jennifer in saying that we both take great pride in your first book, your new job, and everything we expect from you. I have to correct Jennifer on one thing, if you'll permit me. She really neglected in introducing Tim to mention what I think is one of his greatest accomplishments. One of the first years, maybe the first year he was here, he ran in the Boston Marathon. He not only ran in the Boston Marathon, he finished the darn race. He not only finished the race, but, and Tim, don't correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I'm right, his time placed him in the top 3%. Time-wise, of all those are in. Now, I think that's pretty darn impressive. Anybody can write a book, Tim.
So if you don't buy a book, he will chase you and catch you.
I had started out with one question, but Tim's last comment prompts me to ask a second question. The second question, and this is to either of you, do we have any sense in a comparative vein of the sustainability or even the stayability of Chinese NGOs compared to maybe elsewhere? I'm assuming a lot collapse every year and disappear. Do we have any sense of the life cycle of an average NGO? How many die off every year, maybe from lack of funding or other reasons? My original question had really to do with your choice of the issue areas that you focused on. This is sort of the question about the book you didn't write, which authors always hate.
My favorite question.
And Guobin, I'd like maybe your thoughts on this too. Tim, if you had chosen different issue areas, and we can all think of a dozen, one of which that occurred to me was groups working with migrant workers, which really does put them in confrontation with various levels of government, but also health issues, women's issues, education issues, a whole range of issues. Had you had 3 other issues, do you think that your basic conclusions would have been different? Or do your basic conclusions, is it your guess that your conclusions are true no matter what you're looking at?
I'll take the second one first. I'm glad you asked that question, because now I can show how prepared I am. Does this?
When
did
it'll
this
come
go
back
off?
on, I'll ask the AV folks, can you turn the screen back on for us? Thanks.
Thank you.
It'll come up in a second. Just scroll down.
I didn't tell him to ask this question.
Yeah, right.
No, I didn't.
He'll get up in a second. You can flick to the slide you want, and then it'll come.
Right here. So actually, you know what I'll do? I'll answer a bit about the first question, and then maybe Guobin can offer anything on the sort of life cycle stuff, if you'd like.
It's coming.
You know, it's hard to always talk about numbers, it's hard to talk about numbers. But you know, a lot of these organizations, there's sort of feast and famine. So, during kind of the heyday of environmental NGOs from sort of late 1990s to the mid 2000s, you had a lot of organizations that were sort of, cropping up. The problem was, and all the data from the research shows this, that they were heavily reliant upon maybe one or two funders. And the minute that those funders go, they die out. So it's not just that they're highly dependent upon some type of funding, it's that it's really just on a couple different funders, and when it's gone, they themselves are gone. And then you had a period of time when HIV NGOs were sort of the thing because the money was there for them. And then the Global Fund decides that they pull out. So now what you're starting to see is HIV/AIDS organizations are falling by the wayside. The sustainability issue is a real big problem, and not one that's easily solved by just searching for new international donors. It's one that needs to be solved for more internally. And so, in a way, your question begs a series of other questions that is part of sort of one of my third large projects that's in the process right now. So invite me back for that book launch, and I'll tell you more. I'm serious. So great question about sort of the other issue areas, and it's one that has come up so many times that I created a couple slides to sort of show people what it is. I mean, I created sort of this conceptual framework that I already discussed about codependent state-society relations, and I differentiate codependent state-society relations from far more oppositional relations and a real co-opted relationship. These gongos that we talk about, we could say these are really co-opted. They have a very positive relationship with the state, but they have no autonomy. On the opposite end of the spectrum, it sounds a bit weird, but bear with me. The most autonomy would be oppositional groups because they're not bound by the state at all, except that they're not going to exist very long, right? Because they are oppositional in nature. So look at this for a couple seconds, and then you'll see where I transposed other organizations. So I place sort of LGBT, HIV/AIDS, environmental organizations all as sort of codependent organizations. I placed something like migrant education a little bit more on the sort of repression side of the negative state response, and religious organizations closer. And then there's the East Turkmenistan independence movement. This is Xinjiang, and Falun Gong, Falun Dafa sort of up there. And then you have trade unions. The All China Women's Federation would be in the more co-opted end. So the question is sort of, would the result sort of be similar? Well, no, it would probably be a little bit different because the nature of relations is different itself. But what's important to keep in mind here is that this is not static, and these organizations can actually move. And if they're not making the adaptations that are required, it's not going to be a codependent relationship, right? If the needs of the state change. What's been so interesting since I've created this slide probably a year ago, what you're seeing is actually more religious organizations, oddly enough, actually have growing codependent relations with local government officials as well, in places where they're doing work that actually helps the needs of the local government, right? To the extent that they help the local government do things like educate migrants or work on poverty alleviation, then they actually can sort of move closer to this green space in the middle that sort of gives them enough opportunities to exist, but also allows them to have a little bit more autonomy than being simply a gongo. Does that answer your question?
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for the opportunity to use my slide.
It's very pretty too.
Thank
I like
you.
the
Well,
colors.
I worked on it.
A couple of responses, but first question here, I thought this is a really interesting map. And Tim, you said that they could move up or down. Do you have any sense what kind of conditions, what kind of reasons they will have to move up, let's say, to move from the less independent to the more independent part?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think one of the best examples would be LGBT groups. The reason that LGBT groups are sort of in this codependent space right now is that they're actually working on issues that are not really or that are not directly about LGBT rights. It's about HIV/AIDS. But with this money sort of going away, what you're seeing now is gay, particularly gay men's organizations, and actually lesbian organizations have been doing this for some time, they're actually sort of moving more to this area, but it's not necessarily because they want to, it's because the nature of the opportunities are sort of going away, right? It's harder for them to sort of create a reason that the state should be supporting their work and allow them to exist. So movement is not just about the choice of the organization. It could be about differences in economic opportunities, changes in economic opportunities, so their funding streams sort of dry up. And the second is that the actual needs of the state can change. So that would, I think what's happening, particularly among gay men's organizations, is that you do have movement up there. It's not necessarily what they want.
You mean they're starting to move more towards gay rights type issues?
Exactly, right.
Yeah, well, thank you. I thought that's really helpful because that might help to understand, to some extent, sustainability of these organizations, because when certain kinds of opportunities close, these NGOs either close down or they migrate to other issue areas where the opportunities might be open.
Yep.
But I think this is a central question, Bob, about how to understand the longer-term sustainability of these organizations themselves. I think they do face a huge challenge despite their, great skills in maneuvering this complicated landscape. Earlier organizations, I think many organizations still, to some extent, and Tim has a lot to say about this in his book, really depends on the leaders of individual organizations. So charismatic leaders help to build strong organizations. When the leaders change their career or have other issues, the organization would really undergo change. I think for the longer term development of NGOs, one major challenge now is whether or not these NGOs can provide a career path for its employees. Many of them don't. Some of them have very small full-time staff. If you can't provide career path, only rely on volunteers, that's not going to be sustainable. And in this respect, I think Chinese NGOs face a huge challenge, because now the current culture is, what are the most prestigious jobs? They are all in the government sectors. They are not in the non-governmental sectors. It's government jobs. Even PhDs now want to get jobs in the government sectors instead of in the academia. So I think that's a major challenge. And to deal with that, China really needs to have a whole set of institutional frameworks there. Tax exemption status for NGOs, possibility of really to be on the similar kind of in terms of status, social status, treated similarly as other sectors. I think that's a major challenge. It's a whole structural issue.
But there are a lot of the international NGOs in China, like NRDC and EDF and WWF. They have big staffs that I think are they become kind of a model as well. NRDC's office is like 30 people, and I assume they get paid okay. But it's just also that I'm seeing that's a new kind of trend, is that some of these people that are at these big international environment, green groups, that they eventually go off and create their own. And I don't think you have a similar model in the HIV/AIDS.
Well, what's interesting about the sort of these bigger international NGOs, and this has created a real source of tension with local smaller NGOs.
They take the best people.
There's a brain drain, right? And so, I talk a lot about competition and acrimony between domestic NGOs and international NGOs, and that's one of the
Some
areas.
other questions. We got to be kind to the audience. Okay, they shot it up. Okay, how about right here? And just quickly say your name, and we want to get a lot of questions, so we'll keep it succinct if we could.
I'll try. Ruth Kurtzbauer, retired Foreign Service officer, used to work in China, worked with civil society as a grants manager type of person. So I had a gung-ho question, but I think a lot of it was answered already, but I'll ask it anyway. Is there any advantage for internal Chinese NGOs of whatever stripe to be affiliated or working with GONCOs. I'm thinking Poverty, Women, and the ACWF. And the second part of that, are GONCOs going abroad as well? And I'll leave other questions for later. Thanks so much.
Well, I think so, but there are difficulties, as you mentioned. Not only there are challenges in terms of collaboration between grassroots NGOs and international NGOs. There are also, I think, issues in terms of collaboration between GONCOs and grassroots NGOs, and they are very different. I think in general, GONCOs have more resources, and they offer a career. They do offer careers to their employees. There are research-oriented institutions which get both funding from the government and international organizations basically on a regular basis, so they don't have to worry about these kind of resources. I'm aware of a few examples. I took a group of students there last summer to visit Chinese environmental NGOs, both GONCOs and NGOs. And in our conversations with both types, we became aware of some degree of willingness actually to try to collaborate between a few organizations, which I'll mention here. But in general, we see the differences immediately when we visited their offices. GONCO offices are much better than offices of grassroots NGOs. So it's a huge gap there. Difficult to really to deal with this.
Well, there's also it's not just that there are advantages for local government or local NGOs to work with, or sort of grassroots organizations to work with GONCOs. Sometimes government funders sort of require that they work with GONCOs, so it might not be necessarily their choice. What I'll also say is that there's a real advantage for local NGOs, sort of grassroots organizations and international organizations to work like a GONCO. I say this because what's been sort of an interesting trend is that a lot of international NGOs, in order to really strengthen their relationship with the state, are looking like GONCOs because they're employing former government officials themselves, to the point where I really have difficulty. If I didn't see the placard on the wall, I'd have difficulty differentiating that from an INGO and a GONCO. And the question about are GONCOs going abroad, I think so. Now, this gets to the issue of what's a GONCO, right? I mean, there aren't a lot of GONCOs that call themselves GONCOs. So that's a problem. But this
They get mad if you call them.
So there's definitely, so I think that's going to play a role. This is sort of on the slide, in the final slide where I talked about where the funding is coming from is going to tell us, I think, a lot about the type of effect that they might have on as they go out. I would suspect that more of the organizations that I find there will be GONCOs than sort of non-GONCOs, which then gets really a non.
I'd like to I want something for your next book, Tim.
Yes.
Story maybe you don't know. The All China Environment Federation. GONCO or not, you guys? GONCO, very good. Just testing you here. So they've actually been working with like the Center for Legal Assistance for Pollution Victims, which is an NGO that has been, does pollution victims pro bono law cases. And Clapfee and some other Chinese lawyers and some Chinese NGOs have been starting to bring public interest law cases on the environment. And so here's an example where it's like, hey, those of us that look at environmental NGOs, oh, they're pushing the envelope, right? And then we start hearing conversations about the National People's Congress trying to clarify who can do public interest law and speculating that maybe we should just let the All China Environment Federation be the only NGO that could bring public interest law cases. So I mean, you're like, oh, there's a big groan from a lot of, that may not be going through, but it shows you that because you had said, NGOs are strategically self-limiting, and here's an example where they're not. They're flexing their muscle, and then we're starting to see, the National People's Congress, probably taking orders from somewhere else. I don't know if that's going to happen, but it's an intriguing development. Some other questions. There's that other guy that shot his hand up. How about let's gather two questions real quick from the gentleman. Okay, she can go first. You can go first. You're cool.
Okay. Thank you very much for the discussion. My name is
Can you
Christ-
put it closer to mouth? So, yeah,
My
there.
name is Christina Ridgway from the University of Michigan. I just graduated. So my question is about the private sector and what is the role of the NGOs and the private sector working together in China?
Okay, NGOs and private sector, and maybe the question from the gentleman behind.
Hello, my name is Tai Lu. I'm a graduate student at American University. So Tim, you talked about the appeal of social entrepreneurship as a model for Chinese NGOs. So do you see the adoption of such a model having effects on the life cycles of these NGOs and therefore the state-NGO relationship?
A good pair of questions. So NGO, private sector relations, and social entrepreneurship.
Well, a couple of responses to the second question. Among the organizations we visited last summer, there were a few which are really sort of social, entrepreneurial organizations, not NGO, but social enterprises. It seems that, well, they are relatively new, first of all, but the few that we had some interactions with, they seems to be very energetically working on very concrete projects with a very small but full-time staff.
And can help me understand, what do we mean when we say social entrepreneurship?
Well, it's for-profit enterprises
Okay, just wanna make sure.
working on social issues like environmental protection and
Okay, just want to make sure we all understand. Yeah.
is that right?
I don't know. I'm asking you.
Yes, that's. I think that's my
Making
understanding.
money.
Yes, it's still for profit, but working on general issue, similar issues as issues that concern non-profit organizations. I think that's one at least experiment that is just beginning as a way to explore the possibilities of longer-term sustainability for these organizations. I'm not really aware how many of these kind of organizations there are, how successful they have been, but it's certainly, I think, it's a plausible approach.
What were the? Can you give us one or two examples of what was a social?
Innovation, environment-related technology. We visited one in Shanghai, and then I think some of these community agriculture projects consider themselves as social enterprises. So organic farms and so on and so forth. And there are very successful ones in Beijing, in Shanghai.
And that's funny you say that, because there's also, I think, one in Chengdu. I never thought of it this way before. Kura, Chengdu Urban Rivers Association. I think that while they're an NGO, I think that there is probably kind of a profit angle to it too.
I have a slide on this one too.
He does. You know what, you guys? Horribly predictable, this audience. They knew he saw it coming.
So no, the question about sort of how that affects the life cycle. That's exactly what I'm interested in this project. And I'm primarily looking at NGOs that have evolved into social enterprises as opposed to ones who were social enterprises to begin with. And there are a couple hypotheses that sort of I'm playing around with here. I mean, the first three are kind of positive ones about sort of the life cycle, that it seems to maybe be a win-win for activism over the long term, that you have more financial independence. You're not bound by what the funder tells you to do. And that actually can free activists to follow what they're more passionate about. What's interesting that I found among NGOs in China is that so many of them were just tired of doing what other people wanted them to do. They wanted to do sort of their own work. That fatigue after a while can weigh onto them to the point where they leave the work altogether. The second one is that this is obviously about longer term sustainability. This can be a way that you can survive over the longer term, and that ultimately might help them retain institutional knowledge, which is lost by these organizations that crop up and then leave when the leader oftentimes leaves or dies or whatever happens. The second is maybe they're now employing these business strategies that allow them to do their work more effectively. Okay, I mean, businesses are successful oftentimes for a reason, that they do the work really well. But the last three are sort of more negative, and I tend to have a more pessimistic view about how social enterprises and entrepreneurship might affect the life cycle. The first is that, after a while, you might be more interested in making money than you were in fulfilling those social goals that you started with in the beginning. It's just, that's not a judgment. It's just what, you might find that the money thing is more fulfilling. I don't know. These material motivations can take control. The second is that you might have this sort of success and vested interest in the current system where you're making money. That why would you want to upend it? This gets to the issue of what the effect of social enterprises on grander political change. And then the final one is, I don't know if anyone here has ever started a new business, but I think the figure is something like 80% of new businesses fail within the first year. New businesses fail. You turn your NGO into a business. That means you have to compete against businesses, maybe people who have far more resources and are better at it than you. So that's not going to be great for the life cycle. I put this work, I'll go back here. I put this work about social enterprises in a evolutionary biology kind of framework, which is actually more political scientists are doing this. And what's interesting about it is that when we think about sort of evolutionary adaptations, generally think that they're for the good over the long term. But if you look at any work on evolutionary biology, they talk a lot about how you can actually evolve down a blind alley that might lead you in the right direction for a while, and then you're dead. And then you go extinct. And that very well could happen with these organizations. That's the pessimistic view, the one that I tend to have. And then on the issue of sort of the private sector, sort of the role of PPPs. I mean, you've done.
Well, I mean, what's interesting is that a trend that's been intriguing over the last couple of years, maybe just a year actually, where you're starting to see more Chinese companies like Alibaba, their philanthropic arm, which is still quite small, but is focused on environmental issues, and you're starting to see some NGOs are seeing this also as a way, it kind of frees them from the dependence on international foundations, which again I really take when Tim said that a lot of Chinese NGOs get frustrated that the funder determines their agenda, because the priorities of international organizations aren't always those that match them on the ground, and that is a growing tension.
I mean, the other point I'll make is that one of the sort of sexy things in China, as in the rest of the world, is corporate social responsibility. Yeah. So you do have sort of movements of, and I don't have a slide on this one. I mean, it exists, but I didn't bring it with me.
Wait, give him a minute. He'll make one.
It's somewhere. I'll find it. But what's actually, it's interesting that you asked these two questions side by side, because what I've been looking at is how you have corporations that are in China that are integrating these CSR projects, and then they start to look more social. And that on the other end, you have these NGOs that are becoming more economic. And at some point, and this maybe be book number 4 or something, but at some point,
and it'll be a great graphic.
It's done. But what will be really interesting is that at some point you could foresee a situation where you don't necessarily know what's really a business and what's really an NGO, right? Maybe a heavily CSR aware, engaged corporation might look a lot like an NGO that's a social enterprise that's really good at making money as well. So.
Probably part Congo. All right, I can't get out of here without Judy Shapiro gets to ask a question just because she's Judy Shapiro.
Thank you. This is a very warm and fuzzy feeling here today.
She's part of the family too.
Yeah, I'm Judy Shapiro from American University. Ever since you Tim, you started talking about the going out movement among environmental NGOs. I've been trying to wrap my mind around it because I'm not coming up with a lot of empirical examples of this. So this is an empirical question. So I'm thinking about the tremendous flow that we see right here at the Wilson Center of NGOs coming in and out, or all the graduate students that I and many other people have trained who are back at Greenpeace or whatever, or Ma Jun's use of the courts coming over to Apple in California. So there's a lot of sort of global civil society going on with the environmental NGOs. And other examples are, I think, more collaborations with International Rivers Network, particularly in Burma, over some of the dam and mining issues. But I'm not visualizing an actual Chinese NGO sort of marching overseas and having a project. And maybe you can educate me, because if that were happening, that would be really interesting. One more thing that I'm thinking about now is I know that the Chinese e-NGOs are very aware of the bad reputation that Chinese international investors are getting, and they're trying to start to pay attention to that. But whether that actually means going to Africa and Latin America is another kind of story on the, actual road building or stadium gifting or mining projects.
Right.
So.
Yeah. Thanks so much. As a quick aside, I'm so glad that you came. Judy is sort of one of the very first people to be engaged in environmental issues, or the study of environmental issues in China. So I definitely credit her with sort of also getting me really passionate about this study. So in terms of sort of empirical examples, I mean, the reality is that we don't think that there are lots and lots, but what we think, and I'm working with another scholar on this project, what we think is that this is going to become a trend. Okay, where there are going to be far more organizations that are engaged in it. Thus far, what we see are organizations that are primarily working on poverty alleviation, which is not an issue area that I've been focused on now, or thus far, but definitely one that I'll be moving into. But Moving Mountains has been doing more work in Africa as well. And to your point about sort of kind of reputational concerns, this then gets to who's sending them there, and are they just going on their own? I suspect that most of these organizations probably have someone who's encouraging them to do it. Now, whether that someone is sort of a Chinese multinational corporation or actually the Chinese government, we don't know yet. But those are the really interesting questions, because I think that will let us know, or it should give us a pretty good indication of the types of things that the types of activities that they have with these organizations, and maybe what they're telling them and how they're training them, if in fact that's what they're doing, that they're training them. So, I mean, great questions that I don't have the answer for yet. So my apologies.
You do have the Global Environmental Institute was in Laos and worked with the Laos government and NGOs on trying to help them make stronger regulations. So when the Chinese and other investors come in, they didn't rip apart the environment. But there's also, let's keep in mind, look at the funders. You always follow the cash, right? I mean, you have foundations like Mott and MacArthur Foundation that have been looking and others who are looking at Chinese overseas ecological footprints. And it's true that right now there are a lot of international environmental NGOs that are getting those grants, and even USAID is focused on this issue. So, but there are some Chinese groups that are getting some of these grants as well, looking at Chinese overseas footprint. And while they maybe, they may be predominantly working within China, but it's coming, Judy. It's coming that these groups are going to start wanting to go to those countries. We're seeing a lot of Chinese academics. Chinese Academy of Environmental Planning has a partnership in Africa looking at Chinese overseas footprint. So it's slowly coming, but so Tim, cutting edge as always. Okay, got time for another couple questions. This side of the room has been, except for Bob, has been strangely quiet. Anyone over here? This guy right in front. He's in the middle. I about need a mic right here. And so let's gather up a couple quick questions.
Thank you. David Renowitz, I have a very naive question. I do not speak Chinese, but I realize that all translation is interpretation. I'm just wondering what the Chinese words for NGO, Gongo, and these other areas are, and what the literal translations would be. What do people think when they hear NGO?
Do
Well,
you want to take?
Yeah, the other question. That's a good one. Another question. Okay, how about Jen?
My name is Jen Salin, and I work at the Congressional Executive Commission on China, and I've met Professor Young before several years ago, and I worked at another organization, another hat. So this is kind of a more technical question on civil society development. There's been a lot of government rhetoric on the loosening of regulations on NGOs, and they've promised to issue new regulations that should have presumably a major impact on NGO registration at the end of the year. And I'm wondering what you think will there be a real impact? That's the first question. And then the second question is, I haven't seen any NGOs, maybe the more autonomous NGOs, actually involved in formulating or adding their opinions to these regulations. I haven't seen anything about these drafts of these coming out, and I'm wondering if you've seen that. Is there any public participation in the discussion of this, or is this really a state-led, regulation?
And we'll get one more question there in the back. Yep.
Thank you. Natalie Lichtenstein. I teach Chinese law as an adjunct at SAIS. Actually, on your question about public participation on the regulations, I think there was an EU UNDP project that had a lot of activities with the Ministry of Civil Affairs that did have a lot of small group consultation on the regulations. I can't comment on the quality of it. But and I guess I would normally expect legislation to be something of a government-led process. But I guess my related question was, as I understand it, a lot of things that one might see in the new regulations, if indeed they come out, would follow some of the experiments that's been going on at the provincial level, and particularly Guangdong. I think these days even more so than Yunnan in terms of different categories of NGOs, if you want, or CSOs, not having registration. I wonder, even though it's past your data point, whether you have any views on that, and also on domestic funding sources other than the government and international NGOs.
Right.
Okay, Troika, have questions?
I can respond to the question about the regulatory sort of front. There has been some work, and there's certainly more discussions than actual work about how to improve this, regulatory framework for the operation of NGOs and nonprofits in China. But the Chinese government now is really having its hands full, dealing with many issues. And I think now in recent years, the priority is to deal with internet rumors, internet management, and so on. But I think the broader trend is important, and it's the same, applies both to the management of NGOs, to the management of protest in the street, and to the management of protest online, which is that, since 2004, the Chinese Communist Party has been sort of very attentive to the issue of improving governance. Improving governance meaning that, for instance, in the field of internet management or NGO management, earlier approach is really more or less reactive approach. It's not so proactive, and very often it's coercive approach. But in recent years, there's a lot more emphasis on sort of softer management, gentle approaches, proactive approaches to the management of civil society and internet. I think there is certainly among some government officials in the civil affairs department willingness to improve the framework for NGOs. Shenzhen supposedly started experimenting with allowing social groups to register without having a supervisory body. So, many of us probably know that, one of the major barriers to the registration of NGOs is that if you want to register, you have to have a government, basically a government agency to serve as your supervisory body. So Shenzhen started experimenting by doing away with this. And a couple of years ago, I haven't heard a lot recently, but there were a lot of excitement about that and the possibility of using Shenzhen again as the SEZ of NGO development and to expand it to nationwide. Shanghai, I think there are some discussions about doing this in Shanghai, but eventually, of course, the citizens and civil groups, what they want is, of course, get rid of that article of requiring civil groups to have a supervisory body, just register on your own. It's moving very slowly. There's some discussions, but moving generally slowly. I think but in general, I think the principle is on the part of the government is how to deal with these social organizations, let them survive and even develop, but not becoming too confrontational.
Right. Whenever you sort of think about registration, it's important to keep in mind that the central government and the local governments have two very different interests when it comes to registering these organizations. So the central government is ultimately interested in controlling the number of the organizations that exist, right? Because they're concerned about the threat of this sort of aggregation of civil society. For local government officials, it's far more complex. For a lot of them, as I sort of suggested in my talk and I write about in the book, these organizations are helping them govern effectively. right? They're the service providers that are necessary because they don't have the economic resources to actually carry out policies that the central government promulgates. And so while for the organizations themselves, they might be most interested in sort of stripping this requirement of having the supervisory state organ, the puopua, right?
Popo, your mother-in-law. Mhm.
But from the perspective of local government officials, I think the biggest concern is the limitation that the registration laws have on the number of organizations that do the same type of work that can exist in the same administrative region. Because if they're, say, interested in controlling HIV/AIDS, they want all hands on deck, right? So you're going to have different interests among sort of different actors that are going to be involved in the whole process. What I will say about the question about the regulations occurring. I was just at a conference on Chinese NGOs with scholars who all study Chinese NGOs, and the majority opinion is that these are not going to actually come out, and if they do, they're not going to have much of an effect. Again, because of there might be a disincentive for local governments to actually implement these regulations. But some people have a more sanguine feeling. And Carla Simon is one who has a far more sanguine opinion about these actually having an impact. So.
And we can't forget so NGO,
there's actually the domestic funding question too. Yeah, what NGO?
Well, the term, a lot of times people just say NGO, but because you don't want to translate directly because it comes out sounding like anarchist, non-governmental.
Sort of, right.
So generally the 社会团体 is what I've, social organization, but people often just say the word NGO. Isn't that what you found?
非政府组织。
非政府组织。
民间组织。
民间组织. So yeah, people's organization or 社会团体.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they tend to use those terms.
The question about sort of the state of domestic funding, this remains one of the biggest problems for these organizations, and I'm always reluctant to talk to sort of suggest that Chinese citizens are not philanthropic, and there are plenty of people who say they aren't, right? That's one easy way to describe why giving is not very high towards NGOs. But actually, if you look at what happened after the earthquake, there was quite a bit of philanthropic giving. I think the biggest problem is big giving, right? And where's the big giving going to? And it seems as though still most big philanthropic gifts from either individuals or corporations are going to, maybe not surprisingly, official Chinese government foundations. Mm-hmm. And that actually makes sense from a logical perspective, because if you're actually giving, not out of the goodness of your heart, but if you're giving to improve your sort of reputation and also curry favor with the state, why would you give money to a truly independent foundation or an NGO when there is this state one that's set up that you can give money to? But I think the reality is that there's not enough work that's been done on philanthropy in China. And I kind of look forward to reading more about it.
Okay, well, these guys were really timely in arriving. They came here on time, so I think we're going to have to wrap up.
Oh, okay.
So even though we could chat all day, you guys. But I want to can we applaud one more time for these two gentlemen? And as I want to thank, Bob, Asia Program, Kissinger Institute, and also it's coming to an end, my Vermont Law School USAID support for environmental governance. They help me put on fun meetings like this on governance issues. And those of you some of you are new to me, if you're interested in China environmental issues, sign up with us. Next month we have our meeting. It's called How Many Light Bulbs Does It Take to Change China? Come check it out. We work on puns here. Thank you so much. Excellent job.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Yeah, it was fun.